I'd like to welcome everyone who's listening to the WFMJ 21 podcast. I'm Jennifer Brindisi, anchor of 21 News Midday from 12 to 1 each day. I also report and do these podcasts, which are just as thrilling for me as I hope they are for you. Today, we'll be talking about former Vice President Walter Mondale, who has recently passed away at the age of 93. And we have a very special guest with us. So happy to have Donna de Blasio, Professor Emerita of History. And she knows quite a bit, I should say that. And she's going to give us some insight into Walter Mondale as a person and then what he did really as a lasting legacy in the world of politics. So thank you for joining us, Donna.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer.
Absolutely. So first, people mourning the passing of Mondale, now they start to talk about him being more than just Carter's vice president. Walter Mondale had a run for a presidency and was perhaps best known for having a female on the ticket for the first time ever.
That's on a major party ticket. That is correct. It was Geraldine Ferraro. And I'm old enough, to say the least, to remember when that happened. I, being Italian American, and a woman and a Catholic, I know I was just thrilled that somebody who looked like me was up there. Actually, even my parents were also both Italian and Italian America were just thrilled. So I know there was that reaction, but the fact that, this is groundbreaking. She would have been the first Italian American on a major party ticket and still the only so far.
At that,
yeah. That is correct. And only would have been the second Catholic. And had they won, she would have been the first Catholic vice president.
Wow. Had they at the time, was it a surprise, I guess, at the time when he chose her? Or was it something that had been discussed?
I think it was something that was discussed that they thought that, well, maybe that would give the Democratic nominee an edge. But you also have to remember Walter Mondale was a lifelong, or at least career-long, proponent of civil rights for persons of color and for women. Mm-hmm. And he thought, his comment was, it was really about time that this happened. And there was a lot of, I can recall at the time, there was a lot of lobbying, if you will, by, folks in the party talking about, we need a woman on the ticket. It's about time, or a person of color, specifically an African-American person. I just was reading some of the articles, and I guess one of the people he had considered was Dianne Feinstein, who's now the senior senator from California. Mm-hmm. And she had been mayor of San Francisco at that point, but opted to go with Ferraro instead. But I remember that generating a lot of, excuse me.
These are the times in the podcast where we all need to have a drink of water because there's a lot of talking that goes on.
Yeah, it's allergies.
And what you said about the activist part of Walter Mondale, he really was an activist in his early days before he got into politics, and then became a senator and worked very hard towards fair housing and a lot of things that I didn't realize were a part of his philosophies and part of his politics, really.
Oh, absolutely. He was with Minnesota was the Democratic Farm Labor Party. That's what their name was. And that whole excuse me, that goes way back. That whole idea of the farm labor stuff. I mean, you were talking about stuff that started in the 19th century. And there was also a Republican version in Wisconsin, the Farm Labor Party, that was, we would call them quote unquote liberals, but they would be considered somewhat left of center. They were the progressive capital P progressive as opposed to small p progressive that came out of the progressive era. And there was a Democratic version, and that was Mondale's. That was his party. And he was, the fair housing was really one of his landmark pieces of legislation. So I don't think people realize how important he was with that in terms of really fighting his whole political career for equity.
Right. I know one of the articles in Politico had called him one of the old school Democrats, perhaps one of the last old school Democrats. And what do you think they mean by that?
That's a really good question. Maybe they mean more like the old New Deal Democrats. I'm not sure. Where you have that, and he saw it. I know from what I've read, government is a force for good, that it can change people's lives for the better. That it's, it's not the enemy of the people. I mean, this whole idea that sometimes you really do, only the federal government can handle certain types of crises that are so big that private charities, et cetera, can't take, it's overwhelming. You can't take care of it. So I don't know. I'm guessing that's some of that, but it may be something like we're seeing now a little bit with Joe Biden. And the fact that the current Democratic Party is basically a center-left party.
Harkening back to some of the philosophies that were really instilled into the Democratic Party, years and years ago.
Right. And a strong support for labor, particularly organized labor. That's really, and that's been, that since the New Deal has really been a heavy undercurrent in Democratic Party politics. They relied, well, of course, as you know, the union movement's not quite what it used to be. But the union movement the labor movement was very important to the Democratic Party, and that they still, support it. Quite, not all of them. There are, but the Democrats still are very much identified with, support for labor and organized labor. So there's that working class kind of undertow that, was or concern for the working class and particularly workers' rights. That is the old party, and I think is still there. So I'm not exactly sure what they mean by an old style Democrat. Because you have all kinds of Democrats, like you have all kinds of Republicans. You got the LBJ kind, you have the JFK kind, you have, you have the Eleanor Roosevelts.
They do mention the New Deal Democrat. That's something Carter saw in Mondale's heritage. I want to talk a little bit about what we were speaking of a little earlier, is that he sort of changed the face of what the vice president's role was going to be. Not only his location in the White House, but his involvement in who the president would choose for various appointments and what kind of they did more collaborating together, I guess, than most presidents and vice presidents had prior to Jimmy Carter. Is that right?
That is quite true. Really, until Mondale, most of them, they waved to each other in passing, kind of thing. And Carter too was influenced by what happened when Roosevelt died. Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. Harry Truman was his vice president, and I think he barely knew Truman. And he never bothered to tell him about the Manhattan Project. The poor man, FDR dies, and the poor man takes office and finds out, oh, by the way, we have this weapon. Wow. Not sure if it's going to work, but this is what it does. Can you imagine that laying in your lap? You've just become president. You're still fighting this war. It's not over yet. Because VE Day is in May and the war doesn't end until September 1st. And obviously Carter knew. He knew his history. He lived through it, and he didn't want his vice president to be
in the dark,
in the nation, to be in that same spot.
That made so much sense to me when I was listening to how he reshaped the president, the role of the president and vice president. Because I guess, many Americans out there may believe they work much more closely together. And they do now because of Walter Mondale, perhaps, or at least in part of what he believed in.
That's correct. He's the one that, as Biden always said about himself with President Obama, I wanted to be the last person in the room. And Mondale did that. And they also have the weekly lunches, and they were together on appointments, and he offered advice to the president. I mean, they worked very closely. And as you mentioned, they moved him out of the executive office building and into the West Wing. And ever since then, that's where the VP has been. And I think that, they're essentially, from what I understand, the spaces are pretty small. I've never been in that part I've been in the White House, but I've not been in the West Wing. And, they can't be all that far from each other would be my guess. It's all, relatively close. And they believe they even, the advisors spoke together and worked together as well. And that's continued. So we're talking almost 50 years of that. 45 years of that kind of a tradition. And, certainly that, if you look at the Veeps since then, I mean, we know how close Dick Cheney was to George W. Bush. They were very close. Mm-hmm. And Al Gore was very close to President Clinton. So, these were important. And that was smart, because you never know what's going to happen. I mean, did LBJ really think he was going to become president on November the 22nd, 1963? And, I guess also from what I understand is that Mondale spoke with Hubert Humphrey when he was mulling the offer from President Carter. And Humphrey, had been treated kind of badly by President Johnson. And, he thought, and I'm sure Mondale thought he was going to try to talk him out of it. And Humphrey said, no, it was the best job he ever had. And that convinced Mondale that, yes, he should become Carter's running mate and obviously now and then vice president. So I think that's kind of telling as well. But he knew from, seeing, somebody like when he was Vice President Lyndon Johnson, he was pretty much sidelined. Now, here's a man who had enormous experience and, contacts everywhere, being sidelined. And then all of a sudden he becomes president and boom. So you never know what's going to happen. And I think Carter was smart enough to know that. And, you kind of have to put aside your ego a little bit too, I would suspect, to be that humble to say, no, I know I need a good vice president. I know I need somebody who can take over if anything happens to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That insight is so important. Now, the run for presidency in 1984, I believe, was not successful. Certain speculation to why it wasn't, but Reagan was very popular and charismatic.
He was definitely. I mean, he had been a movie actor, so he had star power, literally. But there was also Mondale saying in front of God and everybody they was going to raise taxes. I believe it was at the Democratic National Convention. Probably, and he admitted later, because that really was a big mistake.
Yeah.
But I don't even think that would have overcome Reagan. He really was, at that point, the economy was picking up and he was very, very popular. So he knew how to, he really was a great communicator. He was terrific at it. And I think there was, I don't know, I'm not sure. It's kind of like I always say about the 1928 election, that they could have, picked, the Democrats could have picked, somebody that was, Moses coming back or some such thing, it would have lost anyway, because the person who was running on a good economy. And that would have been Hoover. It was a great economy at the time. And the other, Coolidge had been very popular, oddly enough, popular because of the mostly because of the economy. And then, the Democrats are running a Catholic, Irish Catholic, L. Smith, who was also what they used to say a wet. It was against prohibition. So that kind of sunk him. But it's kind of it was the same thing in 1984, I think. I don't know what the Democrats could have done, or who they could have run that would have defeated Reagan, because he really was. He had, American people saw him that in that lens, and they thought he was very popular, and they had done a lot.
I that really brings about the lens, the external influences that are happening in the world, and how people see themselves, how people see the world is really then is how they sort of choose who they back, not just what party lines they fall for. When you said that Walter Mondale said he'd raise taxes, I had read that same thing, and he had joked and said, Reagan will tell you he won't, but will. I'm going to tell you straight up front that I'm going to. So he seemed to have a sense of humor, least in this. And that was a part of his, I guess, person that a lot of people didn't know about him, was that, he enjoyed the jobs that he held. After being in that unsuccessful run, he stayed very active, from what I understand.
He became President Clinton's ambassador to Japan. And so that was he had gone back to practicing law and everything, and then so he became ambassador to Japan in the Clinton administration. So that's kind of I think that's an interesting one. And he was always a public servant. That was then when it was at 2002, when Senator Paul Wellstone died in a crash. And it was in the middle of the election, and they had Mondale. They asked him to run in Wellstone's place, and he did lose that election. But that was really he was still very active in public life and public service, right? And mentored mentored a lot of people. Amy Klobuchar was mentored by him.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I read something somewhere that she had been she had worked for him as I don't know what she did. Something about
maybe in a Senate office.
Yeah, something in the office, and he was really good at mentoring young people for politics, and he convinced her to run for office.
I'm seeing that now. She called him a mentor, and called him an amazing leader who made a difference on the national stage. It's interesting too, because he also taught, and I think I wasn't aware that he was also a teacher, and taught university students at some point.
Taught law, yeah. Well, obviously a law degree. So yeah, he taught University of Minnesota, visiting professor of law. Yeah, that's pretty interesting too. So I mean, he always had that public aspect, and I think the other thing that others have commented on was his just basic decency and kindness, and yes, and he had a wicked sense of humor. Apparently, one of the anecdotes I read is he had considered running for president in 1976, but he said he wasn't going to, because he really didn't want to spend the next 2 years in a Holiday Inn or whatever hotel. And then of course he becomes the running mate for Carter. And somebody asked him about it. He goes, well, I really hear they've upgraded their amenities. Which I thought was delightful. I said, yep.
That's wonderful.
That's a great story.
A long life of service. And I enjoy looking back at some of the photos of him with Jimmy Carter, of him in the Senate, of him campaigning. just very showed that sense of real kind-hearted social person who wanted to be around people, and wasn't the kind that wanted to be maybe so surrounded by Secret Service, wanted to branch out a little bit and shake some hands. And I think that the pictures show that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, his humility is interesting too, and he had I think from what I've read, a really good sense of himself. And he said, "Look, I know I'm not the greatest orator." He admitted that I'm not a public speaker, I'm not a great orator, and that he didn't have charisma, and he knew that, but he was just such a solid, decent human being, And I like that he mentored younger people. I think that's important.
I think that's so important when you leave that legacy, because everybody takes a part of what you gave them, whether it be a piece of advice or years of experience. They learned something and valued it enough to put it into their current job and their current role. And I think that's just really how everybody should be. It died at the age of 93, a long life. And I guess, Donna, are there any last few words that you would want to say about him and his lasting legacy?
Well, I think it's interesting. He was quite a family man. His wife, Joan, preceded him in death. I'm going to say, I believe she died in 2014. And so they were married a very long time, 3 children. And his daughter, Eleanor, passed away also because I believe she had brain cancer. And then he has 2 sons that survived and grandchildren. So he's got that personal legacy. But I think I got to say, I really think his biggest impact is how he and President Carter changed the office of the vice presidency to make it something that really, I guess, more meaningful, and that person that you pick can contribute and learn. And, God forbid anything does happen, right? That person can step in if they have to. And, doesn't get a big surprise like, oh, by the way, let me tell you about the nuclear weapons we are developing. Yeah, I mean, that I can't imagine. No. I still think about poor Truman going,
what?
I mean, thank God D-Day was way over, right? But it was like, we're doing what?
Why did someone not prepare me for this?
He had been vice president as of January the 20th, 1945, and FDR dies early April, and no one told you in that 2.5 months that, oh, Harry, by the way, I think I just think of that poor man. So having learned from that, I think the way Mondale was willing and Carter were willing to transform that office is really important and significant. And obviously it's still with us. I mean, when President Biden asked VP Harris to join the ticket, they agreed she would be the last one in the room, that they would have their weekly lunches, that everything he had done under Obama was the stuff that Mondale did under Carter. So it's a nice continuity, and I think something that's changed the way we govern for the better.
I wonder what his thoughts were. I'm sure I could find them when Biden and Kamala Harris were elected. After so many people compared, the last female who was on the major ticket as vice president. I wonder what his thoughts were for this year.
That would be interesting. I'm sure. I think you're right. You probably can find that.
Right.
I mean, he had, there have been 3 nominees, because there's Sarah Palin back in the 08 election, the 08 election, and now VP Harris. So, and I should add to his legacy of fighting for equity in government and in society will also be his 2 legacies. Will be the vice presidency, and I think his lifelong dedication and pursuit of equity for all should be part of his legacy.
Something that rings so true in 2021.
Amen.
And
especially as we're all waiting the results of the Derek Chauvin trial.
Yes. Who knew the foreshadowing that he would be a part of when he was passing those things, for those things, talking about those very issues. And years later, it would be such a different world, yet the same in many ways.
Right.
And still fighting for those senses of equality. Donna, I really appreciate your insight. Thank you so much. It was a nice way to talk about Walter Mondale and hear a bit about his personal life and his professional life and what he believed in. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. This was lovely. I'm glad I got a chance to talk about this.